Welcome to a world where ancient voices still whisper through the winds. Step into the timeless stories of native tribes, filled with sacred rituals, powerful legends, and deep-rooted wisdom. Grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and prepare to walk the path of spirit, strength, and mystery. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Your roots matter here. If these stories move you, give this video a like and subscribe for more sacred journeys. The drumbeat are calling. Let the journey begin. What if I told you there's a tribe with over 55,000 members who have no reservation, no federal recognition, yet still have their own schools, police, government, and fought off the Ku Klux Klan with shotguns and sacred drums? They are called the Lumbee, and they've spent centuries proving they exist. To a country that tried to forget them, this is not a history lesson. This is a story of fire, family, and fierce survival. There is a river in North Carolina where time seems to slow down. The water moves like breath, quiet but endless, carving a path through pine woods and tobacco fields. That river is called the Lumbee, and it does not forget. Neither do the people who bear its name. The Lumbee Tribe is one of the largest Native American tribes east of the Mississippi, over 55,000 strong, and yet they have no federal recognition, no ancestral land that the US government officially respects, no reservation, no casino, no sovereignty, but they are still here, and that in itself is a revolution. This is the story of a people who built their identity not from land or treaties, but from endurance, memory, and the stubborn refusal to vanish. No one can say exactly when the Lumbee began. There is no single origin myth, no neat historical folder to open. Some say they are the survivors of the Lost Colony of Roanoke, the English settlers who vanished in the 1500s. Others trace them to the Sierra, Tuscarora, and other southeastern tribes who escaped forced relocation by hiding, blending into the swamps, and marrying freed black people and Scottish settlers. The truth is probably all of it, and none of it, because the Lumbee were never just one thing. They were the pieces left behind, the fragments of genocide and migration. The song that kept being sung even when no one remembered who first hummed the tune, and like the river that gave them their name, they refused to be still. By the 1800s, they'd formed a tight-knit community in Robeson County. They farmed their land, spoke a unique dialect, and built churches where drums hid beneath pews. But America didn't know what to do with a tribe that didn't fit the boxes. The Lumbee were neither white, nor fully black, nor Indian enough in the eyes of government clerks. And so, they were often listed as free people of color, a label that erased who they were in ink, even as their bloodline remained unchanged. They were excluded from white schools, but refused to send their children to black ones. So they built their own. They were told they had no tribe, no proof, no lineage, but their surnames, Locklear, Oxendine, Brayboy, Chavis, whispered otherwise, generation after generation. Without a homeland, they created a nation in plain sight. A nation made of church, picnics, front porch elders, and Sunday gospel that rang like prayer and protest all at once. When the federal government created the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Lumbee were left in limbo, recognized by the state but denied by Washington, always acknowledged but never accepted. Even in 1956, when Congress passed the Lumbee Act, granting partial recognition, they added a cruel twist, a clause that barred the tribe from accessing the benefits and sovereignty other tribes receive. It was a recognition designed to silence rather than uplift. But the Lumbee, as always, did not disappear. They built schools, founded newspapers, fought in every American war since the Revolution. And when the Ku Klux Klan came to town in 1958 to remind them of their place, the Lumbee met them with rifles and courage and sent the Klan fleeing into the night. They didn't need a homeland to stand their ground today. The Lumbee still live mostly in Robeson County and surrounding areas. Their accents carry traces of Old Carolina, Scottish rhythm, and ancient tongues long silenced. Their blood is a mixture of everything this country tried to separate, and yet they remain distinct, because homeland isn't always dirt. Sometimes it's breath and bone, and memory passed from palm to palm like river stones. They are a tribe with no reservation, but they've made a home of everything. And now, as a new generation armed with smartphones, college degrees, and family stories so old they feel like scriptures, a Lumbee continue to ask the same question. If we're not a tribe, then why do we still speak like one, pray like one, fight like one, and dream like one? That answer flows like the river Dot, which takes us to the place where it all began. The water that never forgets. They call it the Lumbee River, but before that, it had no name, only a presence. It flowed like breath through the lungs of the pines, feeding swamp and spirit alike. It did not ask for attention. It simply was. Silent, patient, endless here. Long before the name Lumbee was carved into court documents and protest signs, there were people, many peoples, some from coastal Algonquian-speaking nations, some from Siouan-speaking groups, pushed inland by war and famine. Some were runaway slaves, some were castaways from European outposts, but they all ended up here, and the river took them in. It's hard to understand the Lumbee without understanding this river. The way it coils like a sleeping serpent, guarding secrets. The way it hides beneath moss and fog, refusing to be pinned down. The way it still sounds like something breathing. To the Lumbee, the river was never just water. It was the memory of something older than language, older than laws. A place where children were told not to speak loudly, because the ancestors were always listening. Where dreams weren't just dreams, but messages. Where snakes could be messengers, and where vanishing wasn't always a bad thing. It meant you belonged to the land now. According to legend, a woman once walked into the river after losing her child. They say she was carried away, not drowned, but absorbed by the water. Her voice can still be heard if you sit quietly near the cypress trees. Some say she's still searching. Some say she found him, and now she keeps watch. Either way, the message is the same. The river remembers what we forget. It was on these banks that the Lumbee, unnamed and unrecognized, built themselves into something solid. No stone monuments, no written treaties, but they planted churches, raised families, created stories that made them feel whole. If you asked a Lumbee elder where they came from, they might not give you a date, or a place you could find on a map. They might simply say, "We come from around here," and that's not a dodge. That's the answer. Because here, identity isn't forged by permission or paper. It's carried in the mud, in the blood, in the current. During the early 1800s, government agents and anthropologists searched desperately for a pure origin of the Lumbee people. They wanted a neat box to file them under Tuscarora, Croatan, Cherokee, Mixtrace, Freedmen. But what they found instead was something far more threatening to the system. A people who didn't need a simple origin to know they were whole. The Lumbee were a living contradiction in a world that only accepted straight lines. They dressed like farmers but sang like warriors. They quoted the Bible but honored the spirits. They baptized in rivers and held funerals under trees. They were both everything and something entirely their own. The Lumbee River became their mother tongue when everything else was stolen. It taught them how to move without making noise, how to stay hidden in plain sight, how to be water shifting, surviving, flowing forward no matter what blocked the way. And so, when the world tried to name them wrongly or erase them entirely, they didn't shout back. They just pointed to the water. And the river said what words never could now. Even in the 21st century, that river still matters. Lumbee families fish there, pray there, mourn there. Teenagers tell ghost stories near its banks. Elders come alone at dawn, not to speak, but to listen. Because the truth is, the river still whispers. It tells us that this tribe did not come from a neat storybook beginning. They were woven from driftwood and fog, assembled in exile, named by spirit, claimed by a river that has never stopped flowing, and that makes what came next even more remarkable. Because while the world kept saying they didn't belong anywhere, they began to stitch their identity into something no one could steal. And that identity would soon be tested by laws, by violence, and by fire. They called it mixed. A word that floated like smoke but carried the weight of 1,000 slurs. To outsiders, the Lumbee were confusing neither black, nor white, nor fully Indian by government standards. But to themselves, they were never confused. They were complete. 3 bloodlines, indigenous, African, and European, ran through the veins of the Lumbee-like braided roots. This wasn't a flaw. This was survival in Robeson County, North Carolina, where pine forests meet tobacco fields, and river fog rolls in like memory. This mixture created a people who refused to fit anyone's script. The government didn't know what to do with them. Southern racists didn't know how to categorize them. Even other native tribes, shaped by federal definitions and blood quantum policies, sometimes looked at the Lumbee with skepticism. But inside the Lumbee community, lineage wasn't a number. It was a name, a song, a porch story. It's easy now to forget how dangerous that mixture once was. During the 1700s and 1800s, people of different races weren't just discouraged from mixing, it was illegal. But the ancestors of the Lumbees, slaves, displaced tribal people, and poor Scottish Highlanders found refuge in each other. They intermarried not because of rebellion, but because of love, a necessity, and the recognition of shared pain. They worked side by side in fields, hid from bounty hunters, shared food, shared songs, and slowly wove a new identity from the scraps left behind. Some Lumbee families still tell stories of grandmothers with high cheekbones who spoke broken Shuon, or great uncles who sang Gaelic hymns in Lumbee churches. Skin tones ranged from copper to cinnamon to coal. Hair textures varied. Eye colors changed like river light. And that variety, while ridiculed by outsiders, became a kind of shield, a quiet resilience, because the world couldn't figure them out, and what it can't categorize, it often tries to erase. In the early 20th century, when Jim Crow was law and schools were segregated by race, Lumbee children were rejected from both white and black classrooms. The state told them they were too dark to be white and not black enough to attend black schools, so they built their own in 1887. The Lumbee founded the Croatan Normal School, later Pembroke State College, now the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, a school built by and for native people who weren't considered Indian enough to be educated elsewhere. That school became more than a campus. It was a cultural lighthouse, a place where Lumbee students could learn, lead, and hold their heads high without explanation. Inside their homes, culture passed from breath to breath. Mothers taught children how to cook collards and cornbread while humming hymns in a dialect you couldn't find in any textbook. Fathers worked second shifts in factories but came home and taught their kids how to hunt, how to listen to the wind, how to keep quiet when the world wanted noise, and always stories about ancestors who walked the woods barefoot, about elders who healed wounds with herbs and murmured prayers over boiling pots, about names Lochla, Chavis, Brayboy, Oxendine, Lowry, names that weren't just names, but proof. Each name held a story of defiance, of union, of refusal to die out to be. Lumbee was to be both visible and invisible. They had no tribal recognition from the federal government, no reservation, no legal land base. But walk through Robeson County, and you'll find Lumbee churches on nearly every corner. Lumbee on barbershops, beauty salons, mechanics, and cafes where fry bread meets pork chop sandwiches. They created a homeland not on maps, but in each other. Outsiders kept asking, "But what are you really?" The Lumbee kept replying, "We're still here." That answer didn't always satisfy. In fact, it threatened people. Because in a country built on separation, black or white, native or not, the Lumbee was something else. Something older. Something true. And in 1956, when Congress passed the Lumbee Act, they gave partial recognition to the tribe, acknowledging their existence, but denying them the benefits and sovereignty that came with full tribal status. It was like telling someone they could wear their name, but not speak it. Still, they held on to that name, and as civil rights movements surged, as culture shifted and identity became a battlefield, the Lumbee stood firm in their three-blood heritage, not half of this or part of that, whole. A people born from the gaps in the system, a tribe not of purity but power, not of conquest but continuity. Today, their youth wear t-shirts that say 100% Lumbee. They dance at powwows with pride, their regalia stitched with symbols of survival. They attend UNC Pembroke, now a full university, where their ancestors once built classrooms with their bare hands. Their bloodlines tell a story that textbooks still hesitate to write, but we're writing it now. In breath, in rhythm, in voiceover, in truth. Because before they fought back with politics and policy, they fought with identity. And that identity was just getting started. If you want to understand the soul of the Lumbee, don't look to museums. Look to porches, wooden porches, warmed by sun, held up by stories and songs. Here, truth doesn't arrive in textbooks. It floats in from the fields with the breeze, served up with fried fish and the hum of cicadas. Faith, music, and memory. These are the three pillars that kept the Lumbee people from sinking when the world tried to wash them away. The Lumbee never had cathedrals or grand temples, but they had churches, hundreds of them, white-painted sanctuaries tucked between tobacco roads and pine stands. Most were small, one room, one steeple, one choir. But inside, voices lifted with a power that could split sorrow in two. The Bible came from colonizers, but the Lumbee made it their own, wove it into the rhythm of their survival. Sunday mornings weren't just sermons, they were community. They were resistance in prayer form, a way to gather when gathering was dangerous, a way to speak when history tried to silence. From pulpit to pew, the word wasn't just read, it was sung, felt, lived. Pastors were storytellers, deacons were historians. Hymns carried the ache of generations. And outside the church walls, another kind of scripture took shape. Music that didn't need permission. Banjo and fiddle, jaw harp and stomp. A blend of native rhythms, Scots-Irish ballads, and gospel blues. This wasn't music for show. It was music for healing. Songs passed down like recipes, evolving with each voice. Lullabies with roots in loss. Dances that remembered what the census forgot. No one needed sheet music. They carried the tune in their blood. Families gathered on back porches after supper. Rocking chairs creaked in time with the beat. Grandmothers clapped. Children danced. Fathers harmonized under moonlight. These nights weren't quiet. They were sacred. Stories traveled between plucks of string and flickers of fireflies. Legends of old Maine, of healing women, of the river spirits who never left. In Lumbee homes, truth wasn't something written on paper. It was something you felt in your gut. The front door might have faced a town that denied them, but the back porch always faced home. This blending of cultures, of faiths, of melodies became a language, and that language was Lumbee. They didn't need to prove who they were to bureaucrats. They sounded like who they were. Their ballads told of outlaws and lovers, of heartbreak and humor. But between the verses, they told another story, one of belonging, of making a place where none was offered, of stitching identity into every note. There's a kind of knowing that happens only in song, a kind of remembering that rises from the chorus. In a world that tried to classify them, the Lumbee made their own categories. Singer, believer, porch poet. Faith wasn't about obedience, it was about survival. Music wasn't about fame, it was about memory, and together they built a cultural backbone that refused to break. If you ask a Lumbee elder about their past, they might not give you dates, but they'll sing you a verse, quote a psalm, tell you about the time Uncle Ray's guitar strings snapped mid-sermon, and the choir just kept singing. These aren't just anecdotes, they're anchors in a tribe where records were scattered, where names were rewritten and bloodlines questioned. The back porch became the archive. The music became the ledger. The Bible became the bond. Even today, these traditions live. In Pembroke's Gospel Festival. In the voices of Lumbee kids singing in church choirs before they can read. In the echoes of a hymn sung over sweet tea and bare feet. It's not nostalgia, it's identity. Because for the Lumbee to be is to believe. To be is to sing. To be is to remember the story before the world tried to write it down wrong. They kept their culture alive, not through war, but through warmth. Not through monuments, but through melody. And when the world said they had no language, no art, no tradition, the Lumbee opened their mouths, and the back porch choir answered. History has a habit of trapping people, locking them in neat boxes with labels, dates, and definitions. But the Lumbee refused to be boxed in. They weren't supposed to exist not as a tribe, not as a people, not as anything other than a question mark in the margins of American memory. And yet, here, they are, not a footnote, but a force. They outsmarted time, slipped through its fingers like river water, for centuries. Anthropologists and politicians alike tried to define the Lumbee and failed. Some called them lost tribes, others labeled them mixed, uncertain, without origin. But the Lumbee didn't need anyone's permission to exist. They knew who they were long before anyone asked. They carried the answer in their bones. The census never got it right. The government never got it right. But the Lumbee didn't wait for recognition. They built lives anyway. They built schools. They built churches. They built towns. They built identity with no blueprint. While other tribes were forced westward by trails soaked in blood, the Lumbee stayed, hidden in the swamps and shadows of Robeson County, unconquered, unremoved, and somehow unseen. That was their strategy. Visibility was vulnerability. Survival meant silence. They became a people of the in-between, between black and white, between erased and remembered. And in that space, they grew powerful. Not through war, but through presence. Not through resistance, but through resilience. While America changed flags and laws and census categories, the Lumbee watched. They adapted without losing their root. In a world obsessed with pure blood and straight lines, the Lumbee was something far more dangerous, a living contradiction that thrived. They married who they loved, learned what they needed, moved with the times, built businesses when denied bank loans, voted when told they couldn't, preached sermons when their history was called a myth. No one could map them, no one could erase them. By the 20th century, bureaucrats tried again. Prove you're Indian, they said. Show us your documents. But how do you document what was hidden to survive? How do you write down a story that was always sung, always whispered, always lived, not filed? So the Lumbee gave them something else. Not silence, not proof, power. They elected native officials, ran newspapers, bought land, took the tools of the colonizer, and carved their own names into the margins of the law. They built the Lumbee Bank, the Lumbee Homecoming, and the heart of Pembroke. Every time history tried to pin them down, they slipped sideways and built something bigger. This wasn't a mistake, it was design. They understood the rules of the American game and refused to play by them. Instead, they rewrote their own. Community over classification, legacy over labels, while other tribes were forced to prove blood quantum. The Lumbee moved by a different logic, one of belonging, of shared memory, of porch songs and funeral hymns, of hands that built the same churches, harvested the same fields, buried the same elders. When federal recognition remained elusive, they kept marching, not just through courtrooms, but through culture. They created films, published memoirs, raised funds, taught their children not just who they were, but how they were Lumbee in practice, not just in paperwork. They had outlasted smallpox, outlived colonizers, outloved oppression. So the question was never whether the Lumbee were real. The question was, how did they survive a system designed to forget them? The answer, they never waited for history to catch up. They outran it, like the river they're named after, slow to anger, deep with meaning. The Lumbee flowed around every obstacle. Time tried to swallow them, but they became the current. And when the world looked again, expecting ruins, it saw a community on its feet. Doctors, teachers, artists, veterans, voters, grandmothers, telling bedtime stories in accents that blended centuries. Children whose bloodlines were questioned by strangers, but never by their kin. Because the Lumbee don't need a document to define them. They are a people written in their own ink. Their very existence bends the timeline, breaks the mold, forces us to ask, what if survival isn't about winning? What if it's about remembering yourself, even when the world forgets? And just as we begin to grasp that, the shadows stir again, reminding us there was a war most people never saw. The Lumbee never asked for war, but war found them anyway, not in cannon blasts or famous battlefields, but in fields of corn and tobacco, where the blades were hidden in plain sight. It wasn't one war, it was many. Some wore uniforms, others wore badges, most didn't wear anything at all, just a quiet smile and a pen that signed someone else's land into someone else's name. For the Lumbee, the battlefield was legal, spiritual, cultural. It was survival by footnote, defense by rumor, assault by policy. But even the sweetest soil remembers blood, and in Robeson County, that blood runs thick beneath every harvest. The cornfields were once community, shared labor, shared meals, shared songs, neighbors traded baskets instead of dollars. Grandparents passed down hoe handles like heirlooms. Every row planted was a verse in the Lumbee survival story. But as white settlers pushed in, those same fields became currency. Suddenly, the land needed deeds. Suddenly, old boundaries drawn by rivers and trees were replaced by ones drawn in ink. And the Lumbee who had always lived here were asked to prove it. Many couldn't, not because they didn't belong, but because the rules had changed mid-game. Some families were pushed to the edge of their own land. Others were told they were too white to be Indian, too Indian to be white. It was a trap with no door and no answer. Even those who stayed faced new enemies, economic ones, political ones, silent ones. Tobacco prices dropped. Mill jobs vanished. And what was left was picked over by systems that saw Lumbee people as inconvenient leftovers of someone else's history. But this tribe didn't just fold. They fought back, quietly, cunningly, in courthouses, in classrooms, in the small print. They became lawyers, teachers, activists. They found the loopholes the system hoped they'd miss. They organized, they educated, they outlasted. One Lumbee man taught his daughter to memorize land boundaries by tree type. Another woman wrote every family history she could gather in the margins of her Bible, just in case someone asked again who she was. It wasn't about revenge. It was about remembering, and sometimes it was about confrontation. In 1958, the Ku Klux Klan tried to hold a rally in Maxton, North Carolina, a warning shot to the Lumbee community. But the tribe answered. Hundreds of Lumbee men, armed with nothing more than flashlights, shotguns, and ancestral rage, showed up and shut it down. The Klan scattered into the trees. They called it the Battle of Hayes Pond, but it wasn't really a battle. It was a statement. You do not come here. You do not erase us. And that spirit still lingers in the fields today, where white crosses mark graves older than the county lines, where corn still grows on land they never left, no matter what the documents claim, because, even without federal recognition, without the government stamp that says real, the Lumbee are undeniable. Their roots aren't in paper. They're in soil, in sweat, in memory taught to this day. Lumbee farmers still rise before the sun, still know the earth by touch, not by title, still plant prayers between rows, and still carry with them the unspoken history of every inch dot, blood in the cornfields, not as tragedy, but as testament. And as the sun dips behind the pines, the breeze hums through the stalks. Not a hymn, not a cry, but something older, something only the land and the Lumbee understand. The Klan didn't expect resistance, not here. Not from them. It was 1958, and Robeson County, North Carolina, was a place the Ku Klux Klan thought they could intimidate. A place they believed would cower in silence beneath the weight of burning crosses and white hoods. They came to remind the Lumbee that they didn't belong, but they left reminded that ghosts don't scare people who've lived through fire. It began, like it always does, with whispers of fear and threats behind closed doors. A Klan rally was planned for January 18th near Maxton, their goal, to put the Indians in their place. Flyers were handed out. Promises were made. Crosses were built. But something was different this time. The Lumbee didn't look away. They gathered, not in protest, in protection. They didn't march. They moved. Silent, sure, shoulder to shoulder. Hunters and farmers, mothers and sons, men in overalls, women in church hats, not radicals, neighbors, tired of being told they were invisible. They decided to become unforgettable. The field near Hayes Pond became the battleground. A rally meant to terrify instead turned into a reckoning. When the clan lit their cross, over 500 Lumbee surrounded them. No violence at first, just presence. Powerful, unbending presence. Then a light bulb shattered. Then a power line cut. Then a bullet fired into the sky, and chaos erupted. The clan fled, ran into the woods, crawled into ditches, hid behind their own hate. White robes crumpled like discarded paper. Their leader, James Catfish Cole, abandoned his followers. He would later be arrested. Not for inciting terror, but for failing to maintain public order. Newspapers called it the Battle of Hayes Pond. But for the Lumbee, it wasn't a battle. It was a reminder. They weren't weak. They weren't confused about who they were. They were a people who had always protected their own, from swamps to courtrooms to cornfields. And on that cold night, they protected their dignity. To Dot, no blood was spilled. That was the point. This wasn't about revenge. It was about presence, proof. A declaration under stars that they weren't shadows anymore. The next day, headlines lit up the country. Armed Indians, Root Clan rally. Clan chased from Lumbee County. The clan ran. Photographs showed Lumbee men smiling beneath broken floodlights, holding captured clan banners. It looked like victory. It was victory, but not the kind measured in trophies, the kind etched in memory. Ask any Lumbee elder today, and they'll tell you, that night wasn't just history, it was ceremony. A line drawn in dirt and spirit. A moment where fear lost its grip. Because the Lumbee didn't win with guns. They won with unity, and unity is a weapon the clan has never understood. The field at Hayes Pond is quiet now. There's no marker, no statue. Just whispers in the grass, and the knowledge passed down through families. We don't run. The Lumbee stood against the clan without a single drop of blood spilled, and that, perhaps, is the most powerful part of the story. They fought not with hate, but with presence, not with vengeance, but with visibility. And in doing so, they rewrote what resistance could look like. In a South haunted by centuries of white supremacy, the Lumbee cracked something that night. Not just fear, but myth. The myth that some people don't fight back. The myth that silence equals surrender. The Lumbee showed the world what happens when you dare to stand tall, even when history has tried to make you kneel. And though the clan tried to return in later years, they never forgot that night. They never returned to Robeson County with the same arrogance, because in the county where the Lumbee live, fire doesn't spread fear, it draws a crowd. And when the flames rose high that night, it wasn't the cross that burned brightest. It was courage. Before there were buildings, there were dreams. Before chalkboards, there were whispers passed across wooden porches and church pews. In Robeson County, education wasn't a gift, it was a fight. The Lumbee were told they didn't belong in white schools. They were told they didn't belong in black schools either. So they carved out a third space, one of their own, not in anger, but in certainty. The certainty that knowing who you are is more powerful than what any institution tells you. It began in 1887, with a schoolhouse built from the bones of hope, the Croatan Normal School, a one-room shack made of splinters and rebellion. It didn't have resources, but it had a reason. Train Indian teachers, pass down Lumbee truth, plant roots deep enough that no flood, no law, no lie could wash them away. Mothers sent their children barefoot. Fathers whittled pencils from leftover pine. Lessons were memorized under the light of kerosene lamps, one alphabet at a time, one prayer, one poem, one promise. They weren't chasing someone else's version of success. They were claiming their right to shape their own. Education, for the Lumbee, wasn't about climbing upward. It was about standing firm, planting, growing, staying, Croatan. Normal became Pembroke State. Pembroke State became the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. And even today, in those college halls, the echoes of those early footsteps remain. You can still hear the dialects, the syllables softened by rivers and heat. You can still feel the heartbeat of a people who refused to be erased. The Lumbee didn't wait to be taught. They taught themselves, not just how to read or write, but how to interpret history, how to question what was missing from the page, how to recognize when your story is written in invisible ink. Their teachers were more than instructors. They were guardians. They didn't just hand out answers, they handed down courage. They taught spelling and science, yes, but also how to sit with your back straight in rooms that weren't built for you, how to speak your name without shrinking, how to carry your ancestors with you, even into classrooms that never mentioned them. In Lumbee homes, education wasn't confined to schools. It was woven into porches, kitchens, and Saturday gospel songs. Grandmothers recited treaties while shelling peas. Uncles turned family trees into oral sagas around fire pits. Children learned history not by textbooks, but by memory, by mouth. By music. To the Lumbee, education wasn't assimilation, it was resistance. Each diploma was not just a personal victory, it was a tribal one. Every graduate carried the weight of hundreds who weren't allowed to learn. And they walked across that stage, not alone, but with the ghosts of those denied entry. Still, the battle wasn't just in the past. Even today, funding is limited, representation is scarce. Lumbee students still navigate systems that never expected them to succeed. But they do, because they know where they come from. They know they're descended from readers and rebels, from barefoot students who crossed swamps just to attend class, from elders who kept school books beside the Bible, because to them both were sacred. To teach yourself when the world won't teach you is the purest kind of revolution. And the Lumbee have been quietly revolting for over a century. Education was never just about jobs or income. It was about something deeper, preservation, a way of holding on, word by word, to an identity constantly under threat. Even now, in the classrooms of Pembroke and the living rooms of Robeson County, the same fire burns. It's passed through spiral notebooks and Sunday lessons, through lullabies and land acknowledgements, through whispered encouragements and loud affirmations. You are Lumbee, you are enough, and you are the author now. Because when no one else writes you into the story, you pick up the pen yourself. And the Lumbee did. They wrote, they studied, they taught. They remembered what the world tried to forget. And that's how a tribe becomes timeless. There are nights in Robeson County when the wind sounds like singing, low, long, drifting through the pine trees. Not voices, exactly something older, something that remembers. To the Lumbee, death is not an ending, it is a return. a folding back into the roots, into the rivers, into the hush of moss-covered branches that have seen too much to speak. Spirits are not gone. They are simply quieter now. They linger in the cracks of wooden floorboards, in the spaces between gospel lyrics, in the smell of cedar smoke and sweet corn. They are the warmth behind a closed door. The reason we look twice at a rocking chair that moves on its own. For the Lumbee, the spirit world is not superstition. It is structure. It is law. It is family, come back to visit. The ancestors do not disappear. They advise, they warn, they guide children away from danger. They remind you when to close the gate. They bring dreams that mean more than daytime. And in a place where history has been torn, rewritten, denied spirits are the record keepers. Ask the elders, and they'll tell you stories of lights moving through the swamp without fire, of voices calling from trees, of mothers who felt the hands of long-gone relatives just when they needed strength the most. These are not ghost stories. They are survival stories, because for a people made to feel invisible, belief is a form of presence, a refusal to vanish. In Lumbee culture, every death is sacred. The body is not just buried, it is placed with care, blanketed in prayer, sent off with songs and food, because the journey continues, and after the funeral, the watching begins. Mirrors may be covered. Doors may be left open for one last goodbye. Children are told to listen closely because a whisper might not be the wind. It might be kin. In some families, they still light a candle for 7 days. In others, they leave an empty chair at the table, not out of fear, but out of respect, because absence does not mean disconnection. To believe in spirits is to believe in memory that refuses to die. And when your tribe has been denied records, denied names, denied borders, memory is everything. It lives in the tobacco fields where grandfathers once worked, in the cracked Bibles that hold more than scripture. They hold family trees, in the feathers left on porches, in the dreams where old faces return, even if you never met them in life. Some say the land itself is alive, that the swamps hum with stories, that when you step into the river, it recognizes your blood, that if you listen closely enough, the frogs speak names. Whether you believe or not, something is felt here, something gentle, something watching. That presence is why so many Lumbee feel a pull back home, even if they move away, even if they build lives in far cities. They return, for funerals, for harvest, for reasons they can't explain, because part of them never left. The spirits hold the community together. They remind the young who they are. They comfort the grieving, and in moments of silence, they fill the gaps. That is the gift, and the weight. To be surrounded by spirits that never leave. You don't just inherit land or names. You inherit the duty to remember to speak aloud the names of those who built the foundation. To teach your children that they are never alone. To walk through the woods not with fear, but with reverence. Because the forest is not empty. The air is not still. And the past is not gone. It's just waiting to be noticed. And as long as someone still tells the stories, the spirits will never fade. They are here, in the laughter, in the thunder, in the pause before you speak. They are the breath between generations. They said it was just noise, just skin stretched over wood, just rhythm, but we knew better. We always knew, to the Lumbee, the drum is not an object. It is a heartbeat, a prayer wrapped in thunder. It is how the soul speaks when the mouth cannot. when history tries to silence. You, the drum, remembers how to shout. But there were times we had to hide it. Times when it was too dangerous to be loud. When being Indian was something you kept behind doors. When your songs could get you fired, shamed, or worse, forgotten. So we hid the drum, sometimes under floorboards, sometimes in barns, sometimes only in memory. The sound never left us, even when we stopped playing it in public. It lived in the way our feet moved at weddings, in the rhythm of the chopping block, in the lullabies that weren't written in books, and still, the state called us other. Still, the world said we didn't count, that if we had no reservations, no feathers, no buffalo, we must be pretending. They didn't hear the drum, because they never listened. The Lumbee didn't need war bonnets to be real. We didn't need teepees to be true. What we had was deeper, quieter, a culture carried in kitchens and back porches, a beat passed hand to hand, foot to ground, hidden but alive, in Robeson County. The pulse of the drum lived in our silence. It came back at night, when kids were asleep and grandmothers tapped the table while telling stories. When cousins clapped rhythm into their thighs without knowing why. When someone hummed an old song and didn't remember where they'd learned it. That's how traditions survive. Not in museums, in muscle, and eventually the hiding stopped. Slowly, the drum came back out, first in small gatherings, then at powwows that nobody thought would last. But we showed up. We danced, we sang, we called the beat back into the open, and what returned was not just music, it was memory, it was proof that we had never left, that we had always been here. Today, the Lumbee drum is louder than it's been in a century. You can hear it at Veterans Powwow in Pembroke. You can hear it behind churches, next to barbecue pits, in school gyms filled with feathers and laughter. The sound is different now, not because it changed, but because we're finally allowed to listen. The drum that once had to be hidden now opens ceremonies. It greets sunrise. It marks graduations, funerals, protests, and weddings. It echoes off concrete and brick buildings that once ignored us, and with every beat, we say something simple. We are still here. The drum is no longer a secret. It is a spotlight. It shines on what they tried to bury, and while the world catches up to the Lumbee story, our language, our struggle, our survival, the drum has already told it. It spoke when we couldn't. It called our children back home. It reminded them that before there were roads or papers or poles, there was rhythm, there was ceremony, there was us. Every Lumbee child who dances today stands on ground kept sacred by sound. Every elder who hears the beat feels the blood of their own childhood rise to meet it. The drum is more than tradition. It is identity made audible. And though we once had to play it in secret, we never let it die. Because when you hold a drum, you hold more than an instrument. You hold the heartbeat of those who refused to be erased. We kept it safe. We kept it sacred. We kept the drum hidden. But we never stopped listening. Recognition is paperwork. Belonging is blood. For the Lumbee, that difference has always been the invisible line, the one they were forced to straddle, then survive. They are the largest tribe east of the Mississippi, 45,000 strong. But to the federal government, for decades, they were simply a question mark, a file that never closed, a box left unchecked. In 1956, Congress passed the Lumbee Act. But it wasn't a gift. It was a cage. The act gave the tribe a name, but none of the rights, no health care, no education aid, no tribal benefits, no sovereignty. It was like being handed a birth certificate that said you exist, and a separate note that whispered, but barely. Recognition, they learned, was not respect. It was a title with no teeth. But long before paperwork, the Lumbee knew who they were. They had their own towns, their own schools, their own churches. They married within, buried their dead with care, prayed in voices older than English. They had language, land, and law, just not the kind Washington approved of. Still, the fight continued, not to become something new, but to be seen for what they already were. For years, they lobbied, marched, testified before blank-eyed men in her backed chairs. Senators asked them to prove they were Indian, as if survival itself wasn't proof enough, as if their blood had to come with a barcode, as if the thousands of Lumbee veterans who'd served in American wars weren't enough to earn even a sliver of dignity. In courtroom after courtroom, the tribe became its own lawyer, its own historian, its own voice. They brought receipts, documents, census records, church rolls, stories passed down like sacred scripture. But sometimes, in America, proof isn't the problem. Power is. In 1988, they came close. Again in the 90s. Again in the 2000s. Each time denied, not because they lacked heritage, but because recognition meant responsibility, and to some, the Lumbee were too big, too complex, too inconvenient to officially welcome. It was as if the nation feared what would happen if the tribe were finally given its full name. But the Lumbee never waited for permission to belong. In Robeson County, they built communities that didn't ask who qualified. They already knew. You could see it in the eyes, in the last names, in the way they moved through funerals and fields and 4th of July parades, with a pride that never needed Washington's stamp. Recognition is a headline. Belonging is a home. And in that home, Lumbee people don't argue about their identity. They live it. They pass it down in casseroles and church pews, in high school football games and gospel choirs. They wear it in the beadwork their grandmothers stitched, in the way they speak, half drawl, half lightning, in the tattoos inked with pine trees and prayers. Even their pain is stitched into the soil. When you grow up Lumbee, you learn that some doors won't open, some scholarships won't apply, some histories won't be taught. But you also learn that recognition doesn't define reality, that being counted isn't the same as being complete, that the soul of a people can't be weighed in policy. Still, the fight isn't over. In 2020, after more than 130 years of petitions and persistence, the US House passed a bill to fully recognize the Lumbee again. But the Senate held back. Again hope, then heartbreak. A pattern familiar to anyone whose identity has ever been debated like a budget. Yet the Lumbee continued not in silence, but in song. They host powwows. They send their kids to college. They elect mayors and judges and pastors. They write books and run businesses and build bridges, literal and otherwise. They teach their children to speak clearly, even when the world talks over them. Recognition may open doors, but it's belonging that fills the room, and the Lumbee have never left. The room, they've been there all along, waiting not to be included, but to be heard, because in the end, belonging isn't something granted, it's something carried, and the Lumbee carry it in every step, every story, every stubborn heartbeat. You can find the Lumbee future on a high school basketball court in Robeson County, in the soft thud of sneakers against waxed wood, in a sideline prayer whispered before the buzzer, in a teenager wearing ribbon skirts and Air Jordans in the same breath. The future doesn't erase the past. It wears it with swagger, with purpose, with a grin that says, I know where I come from, and I'm choosing where I go. Once, being Lumbee meant hiding, surviving, finding safety in invisibility. Now, it means showing up, loud, proud, and unfiltered, at open mic nights, on TikTok, in tribal council meetings, streamed on phones held by hands with chipped nail polish and heritage burning beneath the skin. Today's Lumbee youth are walking contradictions, and that's the point. They are fry bread and fast food. They rap and they river dance. They listen to powwow drums on Monday and trap beats by Friday. They wear beaded earrings with hoodies, Pendleton blankets over metal folding chairs at quinceañeras and cookouts. This generation doesn't flinch at blending the sacred with the streetwise, because culture isn't frozen. It flows like the Lumbee River, winding through pine trees and pickup trucks, through dorm rooms and family reunions, through every body that dares to claim the name. They are reclaiming spaces where they were once erased. College campuses, state offices, fashion runways, and yes, even YouTube documentaries. They know what their grandparents endured. The locked doors, the silent prayers, the years spent screaming for recognition into an indifferent sky. And they carry that history not as weight, but as armor. It shows up in how they speak. The accent part, southern gospel, part sharpened edge, doesn't try to sound like anything else. It is Lumbee, and it tells the world, we exist, we're here, we are not fading. They start businesses with names pulled from tribal history. They publish books that don't explain who they are. They declare it, they challenge school boards, and sit on commissions and still find time to DJ backyard weddings under strings of Edison, bulbs and mosquito netting. They are not waiting to be included. They're designing the invite list, and still, they return home to the same back porches where stories were told, to the churches where ancestors whispered into stained glass, to the swamps and the sandhills, the red clay and tobacco, fields that held their parents and their parents before them. Because no matter how far they go, to Atlanta, to LA, to DC, something in the soil keeps calling them back. Lumbee identity is not a costume to be worn on ceremony days. It's in the blood, in the beat, in the way their eyes shine when they say, yes, I'm Indian. Yes, I'm from here. It's in the way they raise their children, not to be safe, but to be sure. Not to shrine, but to shine. The drumbeat continues, sometimes on SoundCloud, sometimes in living rooms, sometimes beneath tattoo needles, sketching ancestors on forearms. But it continues, because the Lumbee have never stayed still. Their history is migration, their strength is adaptation, and their spirit is innovation. Some elders worry the young ones might forget, that the old ways might vanish in the flood of hashtags and headlines. But the truth is, they're not forgetting. There are a mix ing. You can hear it in the way they laugh at family dinners, in how they quote their aunties in group chats, in the sly jokes that only make sense if you've sat through a Robeson County funeral or a church potluck that ran out of banana pudding too fast. This is what survival looks like when it grows up. Confident, creative, and beautifully complicated. A future where beadwork lives beside Bluetooth, where regalia meets rhythm, where moccasins dance beside Jordans, not in conflict but in concert, because the Lumbee never had to choose between old and new. They were always both, and that, maybe more than anything, is what makes their story different. They didn't vanish. They evolved, and the world, finally, is starting to watch.